So, speaking of film festivals and Edinburgh Film Festival, the films that we're reviewing this month are very much were part of the Edinburgh International Film Festival, two of them, and the El Conde came out of a few festivals the past couple weeks. So we'll start with the first film that we're reviewing today, and that is Fremont. That was the final film of the Edinburgh International Film Festival.
Tell me about the situation in Afghanistan before you left to come here.
I don't spend much time thinking.
Why?
Too busy with my social life. Thank you.
Fortune messages. They shouldn't be too lucky. They shouldn't be too unlucky.
Some pursue happiness you created.
اینجا جای کلان است پر از انسان‌های مختلف و من نگو که هیچ وقت احساس تنهایی نمی‌کنی.
البته که میکنم.
I'm not meeting anybody.
You don't need anybody. You need someone special.
I admire people like you who have stories to tell of courage and displacement. Guess which immigrant hero I love the most? White Fang.
The dog.
Where are you from?
I'm from Afghanistan.
I've never met an Afghan before. You seem like a friendly people.
We are. I'm just not a good example.
It's okay to feel lonely sometimes. It would be very strange if people did not think about other possibilities, about other people.
And Clara, can you tell us just a little bit about this film?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, forgive how many words I'm using to describe this film. A lot came to mind, but it is very rich and nuanced. But yeah, so Fremont. Fremont's an absurdist, wry, really dreamlike, but deadpan and poignant, funny, romantic, but ultimately really captivating film, directed by the London-based Iranian filmmaker Babak Jalali, about an Afghan refugee, formerly a translator for the American Army in Kabul, who finds herself in Fremont, California, working in a fortune cookie factory, writing prognostications and struggling to find love, connection, and a sense of belonging and peace. So I love this film. I think it hits all the right notes for me. I've seen a lot of comparisons to early Jim Jarmusch, which I totally see in the style of the film. It's just fantastic for the amount of characters which are so relatable and so hilarious. The characters are really an analogous group of isolated and lonely oddball types. They're all just sort of drifting through life in the same corner of California, somehow thrown together. The main character, Donya, is this abstinent main character sort of barreling through the bureaucracy and bafflingly American nature of those around her, who all have their very distinct foibles, completely uncompromisingly. And yeah, tries to find her way through the relationships that she finds around her as a refugee. It's really balanced, I think, in its tenderness and its poignancy, in its wit, and its absurdism and comedy. It manages to be really gentle, but also really powerful. And yeah, just like captivating all the way through.
Yeah, I really liked it. I was very charmed by it. I love the kind of subtle criticism of America and the kind of American immigrant experience it expresses as well. Because I think there's a lot to criticize America for with regards to Afghanistan. And Donya's just come over having worked for the US Army as a translator and has had to flee when the Taliban came back to power after America withdrew and left the power vacuum there. So it's a very subtle depiction of America as a place where you are surrounded by platitudes. I mean, she is literally surrounded by platitudes in working in a fortune cookie factory, but also her psychiatrist, played by Gregg Turkington,
so good,
just gives her platitudes, just reads from novels about a wolf to her. It's a really good depiction and criticism of kind of America and the American cultural experience for an immigrant coming over.
I love the sort of panacea that she's given as like the American cult of self-love panacea, just like
Exactly.
she's being told to as a self to all her very complex problems as a refugee who's probably seen a lot of things, having worked on the naval base and seen the Taliban take power again, that she should just repeat the affirmation, "I love myself," over and over again.
Yeah.
Which I think it's a brilliant send up of it's a nice, very simple satire of America, I think, at points.
Yeah, and the humor that it goes for with that. So I think I'm just going to echo the two of you. And I enjoyed this film. I liked it a lot, and I think the performance at the center of it. So Anaita Wali Zada, who's playing Donya, who is an Afghan refugee herself, as far as I could make out from the materials I found online. It's a really good performance. Like, because it's a very hard type of humor to carry that, right? And it really works for what the film is doing, and I think Simon's outlined a lot of that really nicely. Because there's more than one way to tell the sort of like the American immigrant story, right? Particularly when you're talking about it coming from a sort of refugee origin.
Well, it's funny that we have 3 films this week. Fremont, Brother, and Past Lives all reflect facets of the immigrant experience, not necessarily in America, but
absolutely. Because actually, when we come to Brother, I'd actually forgotten about that aspect of it. But yeah, you're quite right, it's there as well. And it's quite hard. It's quite easy to make it a very sort of heightened, emotive story, and but this is just very. It's gentle, right? But there's a real confidence with it, right? It knows what it's doing, and it really kind of executes it superbly. And I have seen a lot of comparisons, and Clara kind of like mentioned them to like Jim Jarmusch, and I think I've seen Coffee and Cigarettes come up quite often, right? Because it's shot in black and white, right? Much like that film is. But the thing is, another film that we spoke about on this show, actually, that actually reminded me quite a lot of, was Ben Schrock's Limbo, that came out about 2 or 3 years ago, that depicted refugees in kind of the Hebrides, and it has that same. The reason it reminded me of that, and it's not exactly the same, of course it isn't, but it has that same sort of deadpan pseudo absurdist approach to what they're experiencing, right? If you think about the opening of Limbo with that, the ridiculous dance scene to Hot Chocolate and things, and just all these guys sitting around going like, what in God's name is this? It's all like, it does share a kind of a tone with the doctor played by Gregg Turkington, like quoting Jack London novels at her in these therapy sessions, right? So to me, it actually reminded me quite a bit of that, and it was really a tone and a humor that I liked a lot, and I think it's quite subtle in the way that it pokes at American kind of like love of America, like the very, like even the way that some, so she works in a fortune cookie factory, and kind of like, her big promotion is moving up from making the cookies to writing the messages for the cookies, right? Another one, like, Simon Smith thing about the platitudes, right? Another thing where kind of like, I've moved up from packaging them to trying to produce them. I'm fully assimilated, right? I've integrated fully. But it's really like even some of the stuff that her boss who runs the place like goes through, and some of the stories he tells, and kind of like, in trying to impart wisdom, it really does kind of, it is quite tragic in a way, right? Like quite how sort of banal and middle of the road it makes things seem, and makes it seem sort of like, this is everything that you should aspire and dream to. And obviously she's not satisfied with this, right? And the tone and the humor it kind of places that against, it makes it an amusing watch. I don't think anybody's gonna be laughing out loud at this film, but it's it's pretty thick and fast with the thing that kind of like absurdist humor. And I like this a lot. It didn't really put a foot wrong for me. It's it's quite a meandering film, right? And I think that's again where some of those comparisons to other filmmakers come in, but for what it's trying to communicate, that is the perfect tone, right? And I think it works superbly for it, and I think the performances are all really, really great. And I don't really have a bad word to say about it. It's a really good film.
Speaking of the platitudes that Donya's boss tries to level at her by way of comfort, I was reminded of, so I think this film does really well. It toes the line between touching and tragic at times, between being absurd and wry and comedic. So there's a really brilliant painting by Felix Nussbaum called The Refugee, which depicts a globe in the foreground of the painting. In the background, there's a man sitting in despair. And I that came to my mind as Donya's boss, who is also who's immigrated from China, tries to highlight the connections between their cultures. And he says, they're looking at a globe, and he says, I was just looking at the world. Did you know that China and Afghanistan share a border? I think that people who share borders share many similarities, trying in a way to connect with her and sort of to bridge that gulf of loneliness that she is feeling and the distance she's feeling from her own culture. But it falls short. And I think that this film captures that. Yeah, it's wryly funny and touching that people are trying to connect with her, and everyone's trying to connect and not quite getting there.
There's a very American sense of loneliness, I think, throughout the film. I think that there's something to love in each of the three central performances from Anaita Wali Zada, Gregg Turkington, and Jeremy Allen White. And I think they all portray loneliness in contemporary America in three very different ways, but obviously all being linked by this sense of loneliness, of ennui, of displacement in Donya's case. I also made note of the limbo comparisons that you mentioned, Jim. Particularly for me in the look of the film. I think the camera work, everything is very fixed, very rigid. So it's all it feels like you can't escape it. You know, even the aspect ratio of the frame is quite boxy and claustrophobic. You know, it's very square, kind of Academy ratio, and it feels confined. It feels confining, which obviously reflects kind of Donya's mental state throughout the film. It was very effective for me. I think it looks great.
Yeah, it reflects the sort of the punishing sense of survivor's guilt that Donya's constantly dealing with.
Yeah, totally.
There's a lot of fear and feeling of being unsafe and displaced and detached, and I really admire the film for. I mean, pretty swiftly off the back of the withdrawal of America and the UK from Afghanistan, covering this issue and covering Afghani refugee story, and encompassing many different facets of that fear and that guilt and that trauma. So the fears of intergenerational trauma seeping into next generations, and the punishing feeling that you experience that while people you know and love continue to suffer, the fripperies of life, like mere love, are decadent and selfish somehow all of a sudden. And there's a brilliant tender moment which I particularly love, where Donya is speaking of that guilt, and asks her neighbor if he also feels guilty for thinking of beautiful things. And he replies, as long as your heart bears the burden of suffering, and as long as you don't forget the past and you don't become an asshole, falling in love is your right. And he feels guilty for not thinking of beautiful things. And I just think it's it's a simple way to look at the spectrum of the experience, but I think it's very powerful in the end.
Great. So Fremont is currently out in cinemas right now, so go check it out. It's a unanimous decision of the Cinetopia team to see it.